Marwen's First Death by Ganymede Jones. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden rays painting the bustling market square in a warm, honey-hued glow. Marwen wove her way through the crowds, a basket laden with fresh fruits and vegetables balanced on her hip. The air was a mixture of mingled scents, the yeasty aroma of baking bread, the pungent fragrance of exotic spices, and the earthy musk of the surrounding forest that cradled Pinemill like a mother's embrace. As Marwen approached a favourite stall, the merchant, a woman whose smile lines mapped a lifetime of joys and sorrows, greeted her warmly.
"Marwen, how are the little ones today?"
Marwen smiled, her heart swelling with maternal pride. "Liora's playing under the pine boughs," she said, nodding to where her daughter skipped amongst a knot of children, their laughter like a song. "She keeps me on my toes, that one. And Holston's already out with the logging crew, taking after his father's work." The merchant nodded, understanding softening her eyes.
Jarrell would be proud. Holston's grown into a fine young man. I pray the gods keep him safe in those woods."
A shadow flickered across Marwen's heart at the mention of the forest. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a concerned murmur. "Some of the loggers said they heard strange sounds last night near the ridge." The merchant frowned, her weathered hands stilling over her wares.
"Oh, Holston didn't mention anything?"
Marwen shook her head, worry an icy trickle down her spine. "No, not that boy. He knows I worry. We never know what's lurking between the pines when it's dark." The merchant nodded sagely, and Marwen gathered her purchases. Her mind now weighted with a mother's fears. The first sign of danger came as a whisper, a tremor that rippled through the earth like a shudder of unease. Marwen paused in her steps, her brow furrowed as she listened intently, trying to discern the source of the disturbance. The birds, usually a constant chorus in the forest's symphony, fell silent, their absence a jarring note of discord that set Marwen's nerves on edge. A ripple of unease passed through the market, the whisper now growing in volume and intensity until it could no longer be ignored.
"Ogres!"
someone said, their voice heavy with dread.
"Ogres are coming."
"Shut up, you fool. The ogres never come this far down the mountain."
But the first tremor became a quake, as a deep rumble thundered through the earth. Villagers froze in place, heads swiveling in unison toward the walls of the village. Their breath held, and the only sound left was the faint rustling of leaves. Marwen's heart seized in her chest, a cold fist of fear squeezing the breath from her lungs. She turned, her eyes frantically scanning the crowded market for a glimpse of Liora's dark braids, her mind racing with the need to gather her daughter close and keep her safe. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Liora was nowhere to be seen, lost in the sea of bodies that suddenly seemed to press in on Marwen from all sides. She pushed forward, her voice rising in a desperate shout, calling her daughter's name over and over again. Finally, Marwen's gaze settled on the small figure of her daughter. Liora stood frozen, her face pale and eyes wide with terror, her dark braids glistening in the fading sunlight. "Mom," Liora mouthed. But the sound of her voice was drowned out by the wall of Pinemill, exploding into a shower of splintered wood and debris. With a roar that reverberated like a thunderclap, the first of the ogres tore through Pinemill's defences. The ground trembled, and the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Massive and hulking, their armour gleamed with spikes and crude metal plates, and their breath hung in the air like a foul fog. Their guttural roars shattered the panicked cries of the villagers. Merchants abandoned their stalls, and families fled in all directions, their frantic screams mingling with the ogres' harsh battle cries. The earth shook with each stomp of the invaders' heavy boots, casting a pall of terror over the village.
Joran, a burly logger with sunburnt cheeks and a scar across his chin, leaned against a tree trunk, catching his breath.
"Hey, Holston, you excited for the Blessing of the Pines festival next week?"
Holston, wiping sweat from his brow, grinned. You know it, Joran. It's the highlight of the year. Good food, great music, and a chance to give thanks to the gods for another prosperous season. Barrick, a wiry man with a mischievous glint in his eye, chimed in.
And let's not forget the dancing. I heard that a certain young lady has her eye on you, Holston. What was her name again? Brianna?
Holston felt his cheeks redden. It's Braina, and I don't know what you're talking about. Joran let out a hearty laugh.
Oh, come on, Holston. Everyone knows she's sweet on you. But I gotta say, she seems a bit too innocent for my taste.
Barrick nodded, smirking.
Hey, I prefer my women with a little more experience, if you know what I mean.
Holston shook his head, chuckling. You two are incorrigible. Braina is a nice girl, and that's all there is to it. Joran grinned.
Aye, the only person more devout than young Braina is that mother of yours, Holston.
Holston's thoughts shifted to his mother and sister. That she is... I'll have to come up with a special prayer to thank the gods for protecting both her and my sister for another year. They mean the world to me. Joran clapped his shoulder.
The gods have been good to us and to all of Pinemill for another year. We all have a reason to show them some special gratitude.
Barrick stretched his arms above his head.
You're right, but mark my words, lads, this festival is going to be one to remember.
As their laughter faded, the forest's ambient noises took a sharp turn. A distant, unsettling roar sliced through the usual rustle of leaves and chirping birds, drawing the men's attention. Joran furrowed his brow, tension lining his face.
Did you guys hear that?
Holston stood up straight, straining his ears. That's no normal forest sound. Holston's words hung in the air as the loggers exchanged worried glances. Suddenly, a thunderous crash echoed through the forest, followed by distant screams and the unmistakable roar of
Ogres!
Joran shouted, his voice laced with alarm.
They must be attacking the village.
The blood drained from the men's faces as they realized the horrible truth. Panic surged through Holston as the image of his mother and sister flashed in his mind. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat echoing the urgent need to protect his family. We have to move now. Without a second thought, the men gathered their tools hastily, their movements fueled by adrenaline. Axes and water skins were thrown into rough sacks, and within moments, they were off.
Marwen clutched Liora tightly, her mind racing as she sought a path to safety. The market had become a battlefield, a jumble of shattered lives and broken dreams. She knew that they had to move quickly if they were to survive. As Marwen rose to take on the challenge of treacherous streets, a sudden flash of eerie light caught her attention. Amidst the rampaging ogres, a towering figure stood out, cloaked in an aura of malevolent power. An ogre sorceress, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly intensity, surveyed the carnage with a cruel satisfaction. Marwen's blood ran cold as she witnessed the sorceress raise her staff, unleashing a burst of arcane energy that shattered a nearby building, sending splinters of wood and clouds of dust billowing into the air. Marwen tore her gaze away, knowing that lingering would only invite danger. She tightened her grip on Liora and pressed on, her heart hammering in her chest as the image of the sorceress burned itself into her memory. The well was close now, a beacon of hope amidst the devastation. With a fierce determination born of a mother's love, Marwen began to weave through the chaos, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, the core of her struggling to maintain a flickering hope that somewhere, beyond the smoke and the screams, lay a chance at salvation. Marwen's heart seized with terror as she glimpsed the ogres lay waste to the village, their clubs and axes cleaving through wood and flesh with equal ease. The screams of the villagers, a discordant choir of fear and pain, rose to mingle with the guttural battle cries of the ogres. But her feet never stopped pounding against the earth as she sought desperately for a place of safety. Liora's tears, hot and desperate, soaked through Marwen's tunic. a poignant reminder of the innocence that hung in the balance. She hoped that Holston, out in the forest and unaware of the horror befalling their home, would stay away. She hoped he would be spared the sight of Pinemill's ruin, even as a selfish part of her longed for his strength and protection. The chaos of the attack swirled around them, a medley of terror and confusion. Marwen's senses were assaulted by the acrid smell of smoke, the metallic tang of blood, and the thunderous pounding of her own heart. She wove through the streets, dodging the grasping hands of ogres and the deadly arc of their weapons, her sole focus on finding a haven for herself and her daughter. As they rounded a corner, Marwen's eyes fell upon the old well, a landmark that had stood at the centre of Pinemill for generations. Its sturdy stone walls seemed to offer a fleeting promise of shelter, a bastion against the storm of violence that raged around them. With a final burst of speed, Marwen raced towards the well, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her arms aching from the weight of her precious burden.
Night had fallen over Pinemill, a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the village whole. The once peaceful streets were overtaken by shadows and chaos, lit only by the flickering flames of burning buildings and the eerie glow of the moon. Holston and his companions fought with a desperate fury, their weapons slick with the black blood of the ogre they had slain. They had managed to fell one of the monstrous creatures, but the victory had come at a terrible cost. 2 of their own lay dead, their bodies broken and twisted amid the rubble. As they paused to catch their breath, a voice rose above the din of battle, trembling with fear and desperation.
This is madness!
Barrick cried, his eyes wide with terror.
We can't hope to defeat them all. We gotta retreat and warn the Duke. Maybe his soldiers can save us.
Holston turned to face him, his jaw set with grim determination. You do what you must, he growled, his voice low and fierce. But I will not leave this village without my family. I will not abandon them to the mercy of these beasts. With those words, he turned and plunged back into the fray, his heart pounding a furious rhythm in his chest. He knew that Marwen and Liora were out there somewhere, lost and afraid in the chaos of the battle. He had to find them, had to bring them to safety, no matter the cost. He raced through the streets, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of his loved ones. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death, a cloying miasma that clung to his skin and filled his lungs with every ragged breath. And then, through the haze of carnage, he saw them. Marwen and Liora were huddled together in the shadow of a crumbling wall, their faces pale with fear and streaked with tears. An ogre loomed over them, its massive form blotting out the moon as it raised its club to strike. Holston let out a roar of rage and desperation, his feet pounding against the earth as he raced towards his family. He leaped forward, his axe flashing in the firelight as he brought it down upon the ogre's back with all the strength he could muster. The creature howled in pain and fury, its attention now focused solely on Holston. They clashed in a whirlwind of steel and savagery, the ogre's brute strength matched against Holston's skill and speed. But even as he fought with every ounce of his being, Holston knew that he was outmatched. The ogre was too strong and its hide too thick, and yet he would not yield, would not let this beast lay a finger on his family. With a final desperate cry, Holston lunged forward, his axe aimed at the ogre's heart. But the creature was too tough, too cunning. Holston's axe had barely scratched its chest before the fiend brought its club down upon Holston's back with a sickening crunch. Pain exploded through Holston's body, a white-hot agony that stole the breath from his lungs and sent him crashing to the ground. He lay there, broken and bleeding, his life ebbing away with every shuddering breath. But even as the darkness closed in around him, Holston's gaze remained fixed on Marwen and Liora, still huddled together. Run, his eyes pleaded. They would run. They had to run. He had bought them time, had given them a chance to escape, and in that moment, as the light faded from his eyes and the world grew dim, he knew that it had all been worth it.
The creature stood over its fallen foe. He poked the lifeless body with his club, watching it slump back into position. A twisted grin of satisfaction etched upon its brutish face. It savoured the moment of triumph, ready to further desecrate the lifeless form at its feet. But then, a wail of anguish pierced the darkness, a sound so raw and primal that even the ogre paused in its sadistic revelry. It turned its head, its beady eyes scanning the shadows until they fell upon Marwen, who crawled through the rubble. She reached Holston's body, her trembling hands cradling his broken form as she pulled him into her lap. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the dirt and blood that caked her skin. Her shoulders shook with the force of her sobs, each one a wordless cry of agony that tore at the very fabric of the night. My boy, not my boy. The ogre watched her, its eyes glinting with a perverse joy. It relished the sight of her suffering, drinking in her despair. But as Marwen's grief began to subside, something else took its place. A fire kindled in her eyes, a blaze of fury that burned away the tears and left only a smouldering determination in its wake. She raised her head, her gaze locking with the ogre's, and spoke in a voice that trembled with barely contained rage. You will pay for this, she hissed, each word dripping with venom. You'll all pay, even if I have to do it with my own hands. The ogre let out a guttural laugh, the sound grating against Marwen's ears like shards of glass. It was amused by her declaration, by the audacity of this small, weak creature who dared to challenge its might. It took a step forward, its massive form looming over Marwen like a mountain of flesh and bone. It raised its club, the weapon still dripping with Holston's blood, and pointed it at her in a gesture of mocking invitation.
Come then, little mother.
It growled, its voice a rumble of sadistic glee.
Let us see your vengeance.
Marwen did not flinch, did not cower before the ogre's taunt. She gently laid Holston's body down upon the ground, her fingers lingering on his face in a final tender caress. Then she rose to her feet, her eyes never leaving the ogre's. She knew that she was no match for the creature, that her vow of vengeance was little more than a futile gesture in the face of such overwhelming power. But in that moment, she didn't care. All that mattered was the burning need to make the monster pay, to see it suffer as she had suffered. "Mom," came the small voice, a call echoing a moment earlier that day. Liora's cry cut through the haze of Marwen's grief and rage, a plaintive plea that tugged at the very core of her being. Marwen's heart was torn asunder, caught between the all-consuming desire for vengeance and the fundamental need to protect what little she had left in this world. She stood before the ogre, her fists clenched and her eyes blazing with a fire that threatened to consume her from within. But even as the flames of her fury burned hot and bright, a cold realization began to seep into her bones. She was powerless against this monster, a mere flicker of flesh in the face of its overwhelming might. To throw herself at the ogre now would be to abandon Liora alone in a world gone mad. The ogre loomed over her, its eyes glinting with cruel amusement as it savoured her inner turmoil. Marwen could see its beady eyes moving back and forth as if its primitive mind was working overtime, trying to calculate how to hurt her most. Suddenly, a sound rang out across the village, a clarion call that shattered the night air like a thunderbolt. It was the blare of horns, distant yet unmistakable, heralding the arrival of reinforcements from beyond the shattered walls of Pinemill. Marwen's head snapped up, her eyes widening with a sudden desperate hope. "Do you hear that beast?" she snarled, her voice still poisonous. "The Duke's men are coming. They will make you pay for what you've done here tonight." But the ogre only chuckled. a low, rumbling sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. It took a step forward, its massive form blotting out the moonlight as it reached out with one gnarled hand. In a flash of movement, it snatched Liora from the ground, dragging her towards it like a rag doll. The child screamed, her small face contorted with terror as she struggled against the ogre's iron grip. "No!" Marwen cried, her voice raw and desperate. She lunged forward, her hands scrabbling at the ogre's leg in a futile attempt to free her daughter. But the creature only laughed, its eyes dancing with malicious glee.
Keep this one.
It growled, its voice a rumble of dark amusement.
New slave toy.
Careful with that one,
A new voice commanded. Her words came out as a silken purr that sent shivers down Marwen's spine.
She may prove useful in the days to come.
As the male ogre's brutish laughter faded into the night, a new presence emerged from the shadows. The ogre sorceress strode into the desecrated square, her every step radiating an aura of power and malevolence that seemed to make the very air tremble in her wake. She was a vision of terrible beauty, her lithe form clad in armor that glinted like obsidian in the moonlight. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, swept over the scene before her, taking in the devastation and the broken bodies that littered the ground. The sorceress ogre continued, her voice now a low, guttural rumble that was both commanding and terrifying. She addressed the male ogre in their native tongue, a language that sounded to Marwen's ears like the grinding of bones. Although she could not understand the words, Marwen could see the effect they had on the male ogre. He straightened, his posture suddenly deferential, and gave a curt nod of acknowledgement. It was clear that the sorceress held sway over him, her authority absolute and unquestioned. Marwen's own body had gone still. The rage that burned within her moments earlier had been snuffed out by a paralyzing fear. With a final, dismissive gesture, the sorceress turned her attention to Marwen. She fixed the grieving mother with a gaze that seemed to pierce her very soul, a smile playing at the corners of her lips that was as cold and cruel as the winter wind.
From one mother to another,
she said, with a tone that made Marwen's skin crawl.
You will all soon wish you were dead.
The words hung in the air like a promise, a dark and terrible vow that Marwen knew in her heart would come to pass. She could only watch, helpless and broken, as the ogres began to retreat, their massive forms moving towards the ghastly pines of the forest. Marwen's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as she watched the ogres drag her daughter away, Liora's wails resounding through the night. She collapsed to the ground, her body racked with sobs as the weight of her loss threatened to crush her very being. But even as the darkness closed in around her, Marwen knew that this was not the end. She would find a way to save her daughter, to make the ogres pay for what they had done. And if it took her last breath, she would see them all burn for the horrors they had wrought upon her family and her home.